In 1944, Germany unleashed the fastest fighter on Earth, the Me-262. It was so advanced that Allied pilots could barely catch it. Many believed it could change the war. So if nothing could outrun it, why did Germany still lose? The answer wasn't another fighter. It was something far more deadly.
It's late 1944. The skies over Europe have been a battlefield for 5 straight years. Allied bombers are pounding Germany from 30,000 feet. American P-51 Mustangs escort them, guns hot, pilots sharp. Then something appears on the horizon. It's moving faster than anything those pilots have ever seen. No propeller, just a low, almost demonic howl as it slices past them at a speed their aircraft physically cannot match. This is the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. And on paper, it should have ended the air war. Here's what this machine was capable of. 540 miles per hour. That's nearly 200 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters of the time. 4 30mm cannons mounted in the nose, not the light machine guns other fighters carried. These were weapons designed to tear apart bombers. One burst, done. The Me-262 could climb away from any interceptor. It could choose when to fight and when to leave. It could attack a B-17 formation, scatter it, and be back on the ground before the escort even turned around. American bomber crews called it the Stormbird. The Germans called it their salvation. On paper, nothing should have been able to stop it. But then, something strange happened.
Now, this is where most people expect a simple story. The Allies built better planes. The Allies won the air war. The end. But that's not what happened. What I'm about to show you is a ranking of the 5 best Allied fighters to challenge the Me-262. And I want you to pay close attention, not to the ranking itself, but to why each one failed. Because by the time we reach number 1, you're going to realize something that changes the entire story.
5. The P-47 Thunderbolt. If sheer brute force could stop the Me-262, the Thunderbolt was your best bet. This aircraft weighed 8 tons. It could absorb punishment that would have torn apart lesser planes. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and that name earned. The Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber machine guns. It could dive like a brick dropped off a cliff. At high altitude, it was fast enough to scare almost anyone. Almost. In level flight, the Me-262 left it behind, not by a little, by a margin that made pursuit pointless. P-47 pilots who reported encounters with the jet described the same thing over and over. It appeared, made a pass, and was gone before they could react. Now, some P-47 pilots did score kills against the Me-262, but not by chasing it. We'll come back to exactly how in a moment. The Thunderbolt was tough, incredibly tough, but catching a jet in open sky? Not going to happen. If raw power couldn't stop the jet, maybe agility could.
4. The Yak-3. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Yak-3 was building one of the most feared reputations of any fighter in the war. Light, extremely maneuverable, fast at low altitudes. German pilots were actually ordered to avoid engaging it below 5,000 meters. That's not a rumor. That was a Luftwaffe directive. And the Yak-3 did encounter Me-262s. There are confirmed engagement records. But here's the problem. The Eastern Front wasn't Germany's priority for jet deployment. Me-262 encounters over Russia were rare, not because the Soviet pilots couldn't fly, but because Germany simply didn't send many jets east. The Yak-3 never got a consistent chance to prove itself against the jet threat. Deadly aircraft, wrong theater. But there's another aircraft that would come much closer.
3. The Spitfire Mark 14. Now we're getting somewhere. The Spitfire Mark 14 was a different animal from the earlier Marks that made the Spitfire famous. Where previous versions used the Merlin engine, the Spitfire Mark 14 was fitted with the Rolls-Royce Griffin, a larger, more powerful engine that pushed top speed past 440 miles per hour. It had exceptional climb rate, better high-altitude performance than most Allied fighters of that period. RAF pilots who flew it described it as genuinely aggressive, a plane that wanted to fight. Against the Me-262, it got closer than almost anything else. There are documented instances of the Spitfire Mark 14 pilots engaging jets and a handful of confirmed kills, usually exploiting the jet's vulnerabilities at specific points in its flight envelope.
but consistently catching one in a fair chase? No. The speed gap was still too wide. The Me-262 could still choose to disengage whenever it wanted. The Allies were improving, and yet the Me-262 kept escaping. And here's where the mystery gets genuinely strange. The fighter that ranked number 1, the best Me-262 hunter in the entire Allied Air Force, wasn't actually faster than the Me-262. Let that sit for a second. The best hunter wasn't faster. We'll get there. But first, we need to talk about another aircraft which heavily tested and troubled the Me-262.
2. The P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang is probably the most celebrated American fighter of the Second World War, and for good reason. Long range, exceptional performance at altitude, it was the aircraft that made deep penetration bomber escort missions possible over Germany. Without the Mustang, the daylight bombing campaign might have collapsed entirely, and the Mustang's pilots did engage Me-262s frequently. Because their job was to protect the bombers, they were constantly in the same airspace where the jets hunted. Experienced P-51 pilots developed smart tactics. They didn't try to chase the jets. Instead, they worked in pairs. They used their superior turn radius at lower speeds. They learned where the Me-262 was predictable, its approach angles when setting up bombing runs, the patterns it flew. And those tactics produced kills. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Mustang wasn't actually the most effective Me-262 hunter, not when you look at the raw numbers, which raises a bigger question. If the most famous Allied fighter wasn't the answer, then what was? The Hawker Tempest. If you're American or younger than 60, there's a decent chance you've barely heard of this aircraft. It doesn't have the Mustang's legend. It doesn't carry the Spitfire's mythology. But among the pilots who flew combat over Europe in 1944 and 45, it had a reputation. The Tempest was built for one thing: low-altitude speed. At deck level, below 10,000 feet, it was one of the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in the entire war, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could put up against it at that altitude. And here's where the story turns. Tempest pilots figured something out about the Me-262 that changed the math entirely. The jet was nearly unstoppable in the air, but it had exactly 2 moments of complete vulnerability: takeoff and landing. The Me-262's engines took time to spool up. During the takeoff run, it was slow, committed to a single direction, completely unable to maneuver. And on final approach, coming in to land at specific German airfields, it had to slow down, drop altitude, and follow a predictable path. Tempest squadrons began hunting those airfields. They would loiter at distance, watching, waiting, and the moment an Me-262 committed to its approach, they dove. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont's Tempest Wing alone accounted for a significant number of confirmed Me-262 kills. Not in fair dogfights, not by being faster, by being patient, by being at the right place at the right time.
Now, stop and notice. Look at every single aircraft on that list. None of them beat the Me-262 because they were faster, not one. The P-47 was slower. The Yak-3 was slower, and rarely in the same theater. The Spitfire Mark 14 was the closest, and still not fast enough in level flight. The Mustang was outrun every time it tried a straight chase. The Tempest was the best hunter in the war, and it won by not chasing at all. The Allies almost never defeated the Me-262 in a fair fight, so the question changes completely. If no Allied aircraft could reliably catch the world's first operational jet fighter, how did Germany lose the air war?
What you're about to hear isn't about flying skill. It isn't about aircraft design. It's about everything around the aircraft. And it turns out, that's where the real war was being fought. Problem 1. The engines. The Messerschmitt E-262 was built around the Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet, the most advanced aircraft engine in the world at that point in history. It was also a complete disaster to maintain. The Jumo 004 had an operational lifespan of approximately 25 hours. 25 hours before it needed a full overhaul. For context, a well-maintained Merlin engine in a Spitfire could run for hundreds of hours. The metallurgy was the issue. Germany was critically short of nickel and chromium, the alloys needed to build turbine blades that could withstand jet engine temperatures. Engineers used inferior substitutes. The blades warped, they cracked, engines failed mid-flight. Messerschmitt E-262 pilots learned to treat their throttles with extraordinary care. Slamming the power too quickly caused compressor stalls. The engine simply stopped. Flameouts in combat were not rare. The aircraft that was supposed to dominate the sky was in practice spending much of its time sitting on the ground waiting for replacement engines.
Problem 2. The fuel. This one is almost poetic in how completely it undermined the program. Germany built the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet, then ran out of fuel to fly it. By late 1944, Allied bombing had systematically destroyed German oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants. The Luftwaffe as a whole was facing catastrophic fuel shortages. Training flights were canceled. Operational sorties were rationed. The Me-262 ran on J2 aviation kerosene rather than high-octane aviation gasoline, which should have been an advantage since it didn't compete with piston engine aircraft for the same fuel. But the production and distribution infrastructure for jet fuel was itself being bombed. Airfields ran dry for days at a time. An aircraft sitting on a runway because there's no fuel to fly it might as well not exist.
Problem 3. The pilots. Here is the cost of 5 years of total war. Germany's most experienced pilots, the men who had flown since Spain, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain, were dead, or exhausted beyond function, or so few in number that they couldn't be risked. The pilots being assigned to Me-262 units in 1944 and 1945 were teenagers with minimal training. The jet was a genuinely demanding aircraft to fly. Its handling characteristics near the stall were unforgiving. Its landing speed was high. Engine management required skill and discipline that took time to develop. The result was a shocking number of accidents. Aircraft lost not to enemy fire, but to pilot error during takeoff and landing. The very windows of vulnerability the Tempest pilots were exploiting. A revolutionary weapon in untrained hands isn't a weapon. It's a liability.
Problem 4. Hitler. And then there was Adolf Hitler. This is perhaps the most infuriating chapter in the Me-262 story, and it's been debated by historians for decades. When Messerschmitt first showed Hitler the Me-262, he asked a question that would haunt the program for over a year. Can this aircraft carry bombs? Hitler was obsessed with retaliation. He wanted a Blitz bomber, a high-speed aircraft that could strike Allied positions in retaliation for the bombing of German cities. His generals and his aviation planners told him repeatedly that the Me-262 was a fighter, that using it as a bomber made no technical sense, that Germany needed air superiority, not another bombing platform. Hitler overruled them. For months, critical months, when Allied forces were building up for the Normandy invasion, the Me-262 program was delayed, redesigned, and confused by orders to develop a jet bomber variant that would never actually work effectively. When the aircraft finally entered combat operations in meaningful numbers, the strategic window to use it as a war-winning fighter had already partially closed. Historians still argue about exactly how decisive this decision was, but the consensus is clear. Hitler's interference cost Germany months of operational deployment of its most advanced weapon at the worst possible time.
Problem 5. The airfields. This is the one that killed it. Everything else, the engines, the fuel, the pilots, Hitler's meddling, all of it funneled toward a single unavoidable vulnerability. The airfields. The Me-262 required longer runways than conventional fighters. Its approach speed was higher. It needed specialized maintenance equipment. It was tied far more than a propeller aircraft to specific, prepared airfields. And Allied intelligence found those airfields. Once the pattern of Me-262 operations was understood, once the Allies knew where the jets were based, the strategy became simple. Bomb the runways, strafe the dispersal areas, destroy the fuel trucks, the spare parts, the maintenance crews, and then do what Roland Beaumont's Tempest Wing did. Wait at altitude near the known approach paths. Because even if you couldn't catch a Me-262 in the air, you could be there when it had to come home.
The Allies didn't defeat the Me-262 by building a faster fighter. What they did instead was something far more systematic, far more patient, and far more devastating.
They didn't attack the aircraft, they attacked everything around it. The fuel that kept it flying, gone. The pilots trained to fly it, dead or broken. The airfields it needed to operate, bombed, strafed, and watched. The factories building replacement parts, rubble. The supply lines delivering raw materials to those factories, cut. The Me-262 was, in the air, essentially untouchable. But a weapon doesn't live in the air. It lives in a supply chain, in a fuel depot, in the hands of a trained pilot, on a runway that has to be somewhere, in a country that can be hit from above, around the clock, with hundreds of bombers a day. Germany built the future of aviation and lost it to the present of logistics. That's not just a story about World War II. That's a lesson about what winning actually means. The side with the best weapon doesn't always win. The side that can sustain the fight usually does. And in 1945, Germany, for all its engineering brilliance, could no longer sustain anything.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.